Hello everyone and welcome to our Faculty for a Future Teaching Hub launch event. I'm Alison Green. So as Faculty for a Future, we have been over the past year exploring the ways in which academia has a responsibility to future life and how to shoulder that burden across the different areas of teaching, research and public engagement. And in this event, we're focusing on our Teaching Hub, our newly launched Teaching Hub. I think one point to make at the outset is that the emerging world of entangled environmental and social crises is an era and not an issue. So in this event, you'll be hearing some presentations from some amazing speakers on the general theme of, or question of that current institutional practices do not foster the types of knowledge and learning required for the 21st century. But I'd also like to say at the outset that we're not just about building capacity for academics to weave the crises into teaching now. So we recognise the need to change the institutional conditions to allow these deeper transformations to take place. We're also working on an institutional engagement toolkit that will share strategies and that will actually start to shift the rules of engagement. And you can sign up to that on the website on the teaching page. So there's a lot of work to be done though to build this wider movement for educational change that has the capacity to bring those institutional shifts. And that's what today's event is going to be about. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first speaker, which is Professor Keri Facer. She is Professor of Educational and Social Futures at Bristol University, and her research focuses on how educational institutions and practices might best adapt to address technological, social, and environmental change. Her work ranges from participatory collaborative projects with local communities to large-scale foresight projects for the UK government. So Keri, welcome. We know that you're taking time out of a very busy schedule today to join us, so we very much appreciate you doing so, and very much looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
It's really wonderful to be here and to be here with such a group of people who are so committed to making the sorts of changes that we need to see in universities. What I'm going to talk about today is some observations that I have from quite a few years now of looking at the intersection of education for sustainability and education for climate change in universities. And what I really want to stress is that we need to shift beyond thinking about content, if you like. So it's not just the question of content of what do we teach, but also a whole range of other questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And I want to suggest that these are the following. Firstly, know thyself. Secondly, understand what we see as the diagnosis of the problem. Third, shift towards a practice of modest collaboration. And fourth, think about the stubborn imagination. So those are the four quick comments that I really want to bring to this conversation today that I hope will be useful. So one of the things that I've noticed, and that it's quite easy to move into when we start thinking about how we can play a role as academics in teaching in this area, is the risk of what Kessel and Burke call teaching as terror management. So in other words, we feel a deep anxiety about the situation as it is at present. We seek to teach about it. And the risk then is that that becomes a practice of projecting our anxieties onto our students so that they can feel equally as worried as we are. And there's a huge problem with that. We started to see quite a lot of research coming out which shows that students go into, for example, climate change courses feeling quite positive that they might be able to do something, and at the end come out feeling anxious, depressed and stressed, which is clearly not where we want to go with this. So the critical thing for me is to think about how we engage with and how we understand our own fears, our own anxieties, our own hopes. How are we addressing these in ourselves before we turn to the teaching process? Because the question we need to ask ourselves is really, how do we support our students to struggle with the emotional, the affective issues that are associated if we take climate change in any way seriously, if we haven't dealt with that ourselves, if we haven't begun to work through these issues ourselves. So I think the first point I really want to make is really the importance of understanding ourselves. The second is really thinking about, what do we think our diagnosis of the problem is? What do we think we're actually trying to address as we're thinking about this question of teaching in a warming world? And the way I frame it is to think about this as four different levels. To think about it as the top level framing, what we might call the litany framing, which is the very visible problem of climate and ecological crisis. We can then also think about it from a structural level, thinking about the economic and social systems that militate and push against sustainability. We can then also think about this from a worldview perspective, thinking about the ways in which different knowledge practices, different traditions, different positionality frames how we understand the problems of the world. So, for example, a common critique of our current situation would be that it comes from a set of worldviews that separate knowledge into discrete disciplines. And finally, at the mythic level, we've got the foundational idea of what does it mean to be human? What is our concept of what it is to be human in terms of our relationship with the planet and with other beings? So if we think about, what I'd invite you to do is think about what your diagnosis is. Where do you see the problem lying? Where on this kind of pyramid do you position yourselves? And how do you position yourself in relation to others that might be coming from different places in that pyramid? And how might you work together? So we can see that these different diagnoses of the problem will lead to different modes of teaching, different forms of educational practice. So we might see a kind of geophysical engineering frame, you know, seeking to help us understand climate systems, ecological systems, engineering responses. We might see the work of social sciences helping us to think about economic and social systems. We might see work in philosophy, in methodology, in the social sciences, thinking about how our different knowledge systems are sustaining, if you like, unproductive ways of being in the world. And then at the mythic level, we've got the deep work of the arts and humanities, helping us to understand what it means to be human in this environment, and some fabulous collaborations between arts, humanities, and biosciences in this area. So critically, one of the things that I think it's useful for this group to discuss when we're thinking about what does it mean to teach in this context, what does it mean to be a faculty for the future in this context, is to think about how our different diagnoses interact with each other and what that might mean for different approaches to education. The third point that I want to make is really about trying to undo and to unlearn some of the really unhelpful practices that we have in academia as we approach these situations. The first of these is really trying to help us let go of our assumption that we might know what the answer is, that we need to set ourselves out as academics to identify the next big thing, you know, to fill the gap in the literature, to really solve everything. We have a very poorly evolved, I think, tendencies in academia to be driven by ego, by individualism, by getting the next promotion. We all have it in us. The only way we survive in academia is if we have a little bit of that in us. And yet in this area, we need to work out how to let some of that go. One of the things we have to do is to also recognize that under some situations, it might be better to get out of the way, to create space for others, to let other people take a lead who know more than we do. So really what I'm thinking about when we think about what would a faculty for the future look like, it really is fundamentally about thinking about us teaching as part of a bigger picture, really exploring the joy of what it means to work with other people, to understand the provisionality, the limits of what each of us bring, and to re-see ourselves also as ecological, as part of an ecology of teaching and learning. And then finally, the point that I think we really need to engage with is to understand the work of our own imagination in this area. And it's really tempting to fall for the story of the ticking time bomb and the kind of heroic narrative of us being able to get in there to just break the connection at the last minute. This was an image that Boris Johnson used at COP26, God help us. He implied that really that this is where we were at the moment. It was a ticking time bomb about to achieve, and if we can just get in there, we can prevent it all happening. For me, we need a different sort of imagination. We need the imagination that knows that the world can be otherwise, even if we don't know what it would look like. But that we also acknowledge that we are in a long predicament here. This is a commitment to sustained work over a long period of time. We might not get that quick feel-good feedback of a kind of heroic intervention. And so really, I'd invite you to think, despite the pressure of the current situation, to invite us all to think, what if we had 100 years? What would we all do in that sort of time frame? What sorts of partnerships would we build? What sorts of root causes would we address? What sort of care would we take as we build our alliances? So really the final point that I want to make when we're thinking about our role as teachers in this setting is if you like, diffusing the search for the quick fix and recognizing that we're in this process for the long haul. So our imagination needs not just to be creative, but to be particularly stubborn. So I'll just finish off really. A faculty for the future, as far as I can see, it's not just about adding in the subject of sustainability. It's about asking hard questions about what we're doing. It's about knowing ourselves, being clear about our diagnosis, creating new collaborative relationships, and cultivating a stubborn imagination. Thanks very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Kerry. That was very thought-provoking, incredibly honest as well. And yes, those points really resonate. I see we're getting some, I think your presentation resonated with the audience too. I can see some comments in the chat to that effect. So thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. I'm now going to move on to introduce Michael Hrebeniak from the New School of the Anthropocene. So Michael has been involved in an educational venture, which in a sense picks up on Kerry's question about, well, what can we do? And what does the future look like? What might it look like? So Michael is an academic, he's an author, he's a filmmaker, a journalist, and an ex-jazz musician at Cambridge University. And he's convener of the New School of the Anthropocene, developed in partnership with the October Gallery, London. So welcome, Michael. Thank you for taking the time out to talk with us today. And I'll hand over to you for your brief presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And thank you to Kerry for a very provocative presentation. I'm afraid the stress level will rise a little bit here, as I am going to speak about the New School of the Anthropocene, this new experimental university project that I'm co-convening, by way of citing Noam Chomsky's recent observation that we've now entered the most dangerous point in human history. The basis of this claim, of course, being an immediate future of unimaginable climate catastrophe, species extinction, as well as a loss of confidence in civic administration systems across the world, and the renewed threat of nuclear war from the rise of authoritarian regimes. But we might also consider how Chomsky's words intersect with the university's own crises of marketization, instrumentalism, graduate debt, and the denigration of humanities subjects, as accelerated by the government's decision to cut 50% of funding for arts courses. And I also note the recent announcement of 200 job losses at Roehampton, with a deletion of a whole raft of established arts courses, and also Sheffield Hallam's decision last week to terminate its English literature degree. So the wider context here is a systematic reconfiguring of education through the present century to serve a relentless social Darwinist focus on competitiveness, resource depletion, and individual acquisition. This is a market ideology accorded a natural status, a condition that the late Mark Fisher named capitalist realism, which, and I quote Mark, seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable, having colonized the dreaming life of the population, and one that's brought us to the point of the collapse of the Earth's life support systems. Now, when it comes to the parameters of the contemporary university, we could equally deploy the term managerialist realism, beyond which educated people supposedly can no longer think or function. This is marked by an obsession with emulating the audit culture of business, of reporting systems, inputs and outcomes that erode the possibility of that freewheeling encounter crucial to the life of the mind, and where those instinctual capacities of trust and empathy are rendered obsolete. This corporate episteme is, of course, a consequence of the government's 2012 funding settlement, which transformed students into financial units and plunged higher educational institutions into crippling debt. With the pay levels of vice chancellors regularly touching 400,000 and teaching increasingly casualized, this has become an extraordinary way to run a public service. And so, within such a system, how can a demoralized, overworked, overmanaged teacher be anything more than a service provider? Or a dispositif, Michel Foucault's term for the administrative mechanisms and the knowledge structures which underscore the exercise of power within the social body. So in exploring what a viable university might look like in the face of biopolitical emergency, the available models of HE seem increasingly unserviceable. And so we might therefore consider a parallel shift into alternative forms of organization, whereby agency might be recovered by the individual and the collective alike, and where the principle of conviviality, Ivan Illich's term, for the autonomous and creative exchange among people and their environment in the face of industrial demands might be restored. So the task then is one of building the new university, or the parasite in the shell of the old, as a means of equipping students with the necessary critical abilities and creative confidence to make interventions to ensure the perpetuation of life on Earth. So the new school of the Anthropocene is one such response, a self-organizing body founded by academics from Cambridge and across the university world, alongside artists and practitioners. The new school, as Alison said, is a collaboration with the October Gallery in London, which is part of the Institute of Ecotechnics, a research hub dedicated to exploring a relationship between humanity and ecosystems through developing sympathetic forms of technology. This has been manifested over 50 years in a series of spectacular biosphere demonstration projects across the planet, most notably Biosphere 2, a vast greenhouse in Arizona, containing a ratio of the Earth's topographies and climate systems as a microcosm, and within which 8 scientists sealed themselves for 2 years in an experiment in closed systems living. And then there's the research vessel Heraclitus, an 80-foot, 3-masted replica 17th century Chinese junk made of ferrocement, which has sailed over 250,000 miles across the world's oceans, collecting coral reef samples and staging theatre workshops. The October Gallery is the Institute's Centre for Urban Ecology in Bloomsbury, dedicated to intercultural engagement through the arts. And these independent sites and several more will be part of a new initiative, the Academia Biospherica, a planetary university that will eventually host on-site education programs across the 5 Earth biomes of mountains, oceans, forests, desert grasslands, and cities. And we're in the process of gaining recognition from UNESCO as a Futures Literacy Laboratory. As a participant within this, the new school's aim is to run its programs as cheaply and as non-bureaucratically as possible, with a pay-what-you-can-afford fee policy to release students from the tyranny of debt. The new school has no governors, no boards of trustees, nor managerial tiers. Everyone is paid the same, and our debut cohort of 20 will arrive in September to study both in person and online. And among them will be several refugees from conflicts in Ukraine, Yemen, and Afghanistan, who will study free of charge with us. Our primary model is the arts educational community of Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina, that ran from 1933 to 57. And we're using Black Mountain not as a geometry of nostalgia, but as a space for the consideration of experiment as a prompt to action, wherein students are regarded as researchers from the very start, entrusted to discover their own patterns within webs of knowledge through collaborative seminars and individual supervisions. Teaching will strongly promote transdisciplinary practices, being more concerned with porosity of subject boundaries than their policing, a principle at one with Ernst Haeckel's 1869 definition of ecology as, I quote, the study of all those complex interactions referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence. Our curriculum addresses the omission of arts disciplines in considerations of biosphere emergency through fostering a re-examination of the cultural narratives and metaphors that shape the human location on Earth. Our main point of departure is Felix Guattari's book, The Three Ecologies from 1989, about the interacting and interdependent ecologies of mind, society, and environment, where meaning is made within and between spheres. Equal stress will be assigned to the critical and the creative act, to individual development and collaborative action, to the body as well as the mind. So this means that more traditional HE activities, such as philosophy, literary criticism, visual culture, and film editing, will be complemented by the study of permaculture, dance, printmaking, and wild swimming. Students will be awarded a diploma in the environmental humanities, a means of disengaging with a degree awarding bureaucracy, and a recognition that personal achievement and growth is not necessarily the same as an anxious culture of accreditation, which legitimizes the material and the psychological burden of a 50 grand debt as a threshold to adulthood and social participation. So in such a context, the new school seeks to explore how HE might prepare students to forge a viable future as stewards for the generations to come, countering that relentless focus on immediate survival and reproducing the destructive practices of the present, including what the late David Graeber termed bullshit jobs. Last September, The Lancet published a survey, Young People's Voices on Climate Anxiety, Government Betrayal and Moral Injury, a global phenomenon, gleaned from interviews with 10,000 young people under 25 from 10 countries. And this survey revealed that 3/4 agreed with the statement, the future is frightening, and 50% reported feeling distressed and anxious about the way climate breakdown is affecting their daily functioning. In the same month, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Highlands and Islands announced his intention to cull what he called Vanity Courses in service of, quote, workforce alignment and supply. And in so doing, he exposed a fundamental dualism between the traditional purpose of the university, which is to challenge given forms of knowledge, and that contemporary obsession with training and skills, which prepares office-ready graduates to operate administrative procedures and adapt to the limits of a given environment. With a public university evidently reinvented as a trade school, how can we therefore genuinely teach for the future and reinstate the adventurous life of the mind as a legitimate value in itself? In the face of this mechanistic customer notion of education, the urgent need is surely to design a curriculum that reflects educational value beyond the enhancement of personal market worth. How then might we retreat from this Gradgrindian notion of education as a set of willed premises to be fulfilled, rather than a shared investigation? As we stand before the prospect of the end of life on Earth, the new school embodies the understanding that to be educated is to inhabit a world of forms and impressions that afford a variety of unpredictable responses. The community is a basic instructional force, and that the pressing need is to nurture producers, not consumers of meaning. And so I'll finish by adding that the new school is not a sentimental bid to reinstate a pre-1990s version of the university, but an inquiry into how to create small, humble, agile, self-determining HE models that are open to collaboration with other organizations, a model that could feasibly be replicated and rolled out regionally. And it's to be considered, therefore, a supplement to, not a replacement of, the HE mainstream, one that strips down the commodified uni package and insists that the function of a college is to teach students. Such an ethos may not be for everyone, but it is for anyone. And in the context of the neoliberal university's ineffectiveness in the face of ecological ruin, I'd like to think of the new school as a counter-nihilism gesture, a gathering of students and teachers forged in conviviality and trust, and a means of addressing the greatest intellectual challenge of this, or indeed any era.
Now, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Vanessa Andriotti from the University of British Columbia. So Vanessa is a Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities and Global Change at UBC, and her research examines historical and systemic patterns of reproduction of inequalities and how these limit or enable possibilities for collective existence and global change. So Vanessa, welcome.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I would like to start by saying that I'm speaking from the unceded ancestral lands of the Stolo Indigenous peoples in what is currently known as Maple Ridge in Canada. And when we start with the land acknowledgement, it should represent a commitment to supporting Indigenous efforts to get their lands back, their stolen lands back and their livelihoods restored, both here in Canada and everywhere. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that I do with a collective of people, the Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures Collective, and also an open course that we have developed based on the analysis that we have that is anchored on post-colonial, decolonial, indigenous studies, and critiques of modernity. So I'll just share my presentation and we can start there. So the collective is called Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures. It is a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and indigenous knowledge keepers, working at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence on the one hand, and questions related to the unsustainability of our current habits of being on the other hand. And it tries to bring together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, economic instability, the global mental health crisis, and intensifications of social and ecological violence, including war. And what we are trying to do is to have an inquiry on education itself, how education, modern education, has contributed to where we are at right now, the mess we're in, and how it could be also mobilized to interrupt that. So we are trying to build containers and expand collective capacity for engagement with global wicked challenges through critical and systems complexity literacies grounded on post-colonial, decolonial, indigenous, and non-Western psychoanalytic approaches. So in terms of the psychoanalytics dimension of this research, the research is grounded on an anchor of 4 socially sanctioned denials. So our analysis is based on denials rather than ignorance, as we acknowledge that colonialism, questions of colonialism are related to socially sanctioned foreclosures. So the first one is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. So our comforts happen at the expense of other people. The second one is the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption, and the focus on profit. The third one is the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land, rather than entangled within the living wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we'll need to face together. The tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and that may address symptoms, but not the root causes of our collective complex predicament. And as I said before, our inquiry is grounded on education. So the first thing that I need to say about this inquiry is that we see our educational context as a complex, also as a wicked challenge, right? And that has certain characteristics. So when we think about designing educational interventions, these are the things we take into account. Number one, that our socio-educational context is one where there is a cacophony of perspectives. There's misinformation overload, in the impossibility of stable authorities or imposed consensus. There's also an oversaturation of unprocessed emotions, a lack of resilience and collective capacity to process complex emotions within and around us, to sit with the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up, because our current education doesn't deal with that too. There's also VUCA, increased volatility, uncertainty, social complexity, and ambiguity, which then creates a context of social fragmentation and polarized perspectives on the common good. There's also incentives for meta-consumption, seeing consumption as a mode of relating to the world. And here I'm not talking only about the consumption of stuff. I'm talking about the consumption of knowledge, of critique, of relationships, of experiences. And there are incentives and rewards for self-centered, hyper-individualistic behavior, creating this meta-entitlement to create reality. And this social media also has a large role to play. And then number 5, we also see a lot of this pattern of self-infantilization, a proliferation of fragilities and entitlements, a demand for coddling, which is described as a failure of the Western culture to produce grown-ups by some of our Indigenous collaborators. And then there is this tendency to see hope as or in prefiguration or in projection rather than relational weaving or possibility in the now. And the 6th layer of this is that there is also intergenerational resentment as we have reached the limits of the planet and the promises of endless prosperity are perceived to be broken. This has been described to us by a young person as a situation where they are watching a train wreck in slow motion. But also what was added to that was that while they still want the Gucci bag. So working with all of that in education is complicated. And as somebody coming from the discipline of education, I can say that we generally tend to think about education as the education we received in our time as students. But what I would like to emphasize here is that the context is completely different now because of social media and because of technology. But not just that, it's that how that's already conditioned and changed the engagement and relationship that people have with learning and with knowledge. So we look at education as a wicked problem, and especially in relationship to the assumptions that are on the screen. The common assumptions that talking about negative things make people feel demotivated, that complexity causes people to feel overwhelmed, that exposing complicities makes people feel uncomfortable, that lack of simple solution immobilizes people, that uncertainty makes people feel anxious, and that talking about the possibility for wider social and ecological collapse can make people feel hopeless and angry. And here I'm saying wider social and ecological collapse because social ecological collapse is happening all the time. In order for us to be here, even having this conversation using the technology that comes from systems of expropriation and oppression in other places. So it's hard not to talk about social ecological collapse, but the widening of the social ecological collapse, whereas it's starting to reach the people who were previously protected from that, is, I think, a sticky issue. But anyway, in education, there is a tendency for people to think about this as only a problem of information. So making it short, simple, easy, fun, and hopeful is what we tend to believe is going to change things. However, if you have an inquiry on education itself, and you start to wonder about how education has been responsible for taking us to where we are today, the questions change a little bit or a lot. And in our inquiry, grounded on decolonial, postcolonial, indigenous theories and non-Western psychoanalytic approaches, we can see that education has been responsible for creating a form of subjectivity that is attracted to certainty, control, comfort, coddling, and convenience, that is afraid of uncertainty, humiliation, worthlessness, and irrelevance, that is uncomfortable with complicity, ambiguity, paradoxes, and contradictions, and where there is a desire for moral authority and accountable autonomy in the arbitration of justice and common sense. So it's like the chicken and the egg thing, right? So we see the subjectivity and we say, okay, so they need more, the short, simple, easy, light, fun, and hopeful. But this is the pattern that actually creates the subjectivity itself. And this subjectivity is unprepared and unequipped to recognize, let alone navigate, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambivalence. And this creates a problem when we are trying to address wicked challenges. And it takes us into a merry-go-round where that subjectivity will be interested in safe, simplistic, feel-good and look-good solutions that sustain the status quo. It's also interested in tokenistic transactional engagements driven by optics and consumption, and that then reproduces a narrow and limited imagination of what's possible and desirable, an ethnocentric horizon or imagination of what is possible. So we've been looking at this problem, thinking about also how education can interrupt the merry-go-round. And we have come up with this distinction between mastery education and depth education. So mastery education could be associated with two images: the image of pouring tea in a cup and then measuring it to see how much knowledge you have, or the image of conquering a peak. It's very dopamine induced or motivate driven. So in contrast, depth education would be more like peeling the layers of an onion and crying in the process, or in comparison to mastering a peak, conquering a peak, it's more like deep diving in the freezing ocean to figure out that our bodies are mostly water and that we are also the water we are diving in, as well as all the toxins that are put in the water. So this kind of depth education is about sitting with what is both good, bad, broken, ugly, and messed up in everything that it's about, like busting the idealization so that we can sit with the reality of what is happening rather than trying to escape that reality into a hopeful future. So how to do that in the current context is definitely a challenge, and that's one of our inquiries about how to offer depth education and invite people into this process. So the depth education questions that we emphasize are three. Number one, how do we prepare ourselves to tackle the wicked problems of our time, including unprecedented complex dilemmas and also disasters of our own making that we will have to face together? Number two, how can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization, and understanding kindness in its multiple layers? How can we learn to choose sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in a culture of late modernity that often promotes and rewards the opposite? So our starting point is a kind of education that can support students to hold space for uncomfortable and difficult things without feeling overwhelmed or immobilized, to navigate VUCA, to layer reality and hold paradoxes in generative ways, to surrender arrogance, idealizations, and projections, to be able to deal with all aspects of reality, the good, bad, the ugly, the messed up, within and around us, to build relationships grounded on trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability. And this is extremely difficult. To be generative translators between layers, disciplines, generations, and cultural contexts, to deepen their self-understanding and self-compassion, and interrupt the merry-go-round of simplistic solutions, ethnocentric ideals, and paternalistic relationships, including greenwashing, whitewashing, and opportunistic solutionism that tries to profit from the crisis. So in that sense, we have a course called Facing Human Wrongs that is TOOC rather than a MOOC, a TOOC because this is a targeted open online course that started at the University of British Columbia as an interdisciplinary course, but now is a Creative Commons course that people can access from anywhere. And we have specific groups outside of the university actually going through that. And you can see the link over there. So the course objectives, it took us about probably 5 years to get to course objectives that were intelligible to people and to the university, but here are they are. So partly we're inviting students to step back, look at the bigger picture and dive deeper, clarify, test and unpack assumptions and the implications of ideas without fear of judgment, acquire, develop languages and vocabularies and analysis to name and productively host internal and external tensions, conflicts and paradoxes, to learn from examples that articulate contextual challenges, successes and failures, to engage with difficult questions while protecting the integrity of relationships, to become comfortable with the discomfort of facing fears, contradictions, and projections, to form relationships of solidarity, not dependent on shared knowledge, identity, and understanding, and to find peace and strength in vulnerability and develop resilience and stamina for the long haul of hospicing a system in decline and assisting with the birth of something new, undefined, and potentially, but not necessarily wiser. So here we talk a lot in the course about learning to walk the tightrope between desperate hope and reckless hopelessness, with sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility as a compass, carrying the balancing rod of intellectual rigor and relational rigor, but learning to walk with honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity. And these are the capacities and dispositions for navigating VUCA that we are trying to develop in the students. And these include diffractive assessment, which is the layering of self and reality in order to be able to sit with paradoxes and complexities. There's diachronic and analectic reasoning, connecting dots in the bigger picture across time, non-dialectically. There's psychoaffective stamina, which is about holding space for difficulties and discomfort without being overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes. There's ontosympathetic resonance, tuning into the pain of others and in oneself, and interrupting harmful desires and perceived entitlements. Polysemic awareness, which is navigating the ambivalence of language and cacophony of perspectives. And there's the SMDR compass calibration, moving towards the colonial forms, sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility, answerability, and accountability as we face shadows, compost shit, and get through storms together. And here's just, I will finish with two slides about the structure of the course. So we structured the course around the denial. So we start with what's education for? And this is a unit that really focuses on how education has contributed to, like especially modern colonial education has contributed to taking us to the space and the mess that we're in. Then there's a unit on the denial of systemic violence, another one on the denial of unsustainability, denial of entanglement, denial of the magnitude of the challenges, and then a debriefing unit, which is called Towards New Mistakes. The course, there's a course inquiry agreement, which asks students to suspend the desire for easy hope and easy solutions in order to expand their capacity to sit in discomfort with the multiple moving layers of complexity of wicked problems and with their complicity and harm. Then we use the bus methodology, which I can talk about later if you are interested, which is about diffractions, like the layering of the self and the taking of a psychoanalytic distance from one's own assumptions and interpretations. And this is crucial for this methodology to work. Then there are video and text diaries where we ask them to use Flipgrid or text to connect dots and explore the complex responses that they have and ask the questions, so what, now what? And they have a feedback choice where they can choose no feedback, sugar-coated feedback, honest feedback, or brutally honest feedback from the instructors. And for each unlearning bundle, which is a unit, there are 8 tasks and a 90-minute tutorial where they talk to themselves, between themselves about that. So there's a lecture, there are exercises in relationship to the lecture and other videos. There are required texts. There's a documentary that they have to watch, and it's a choice between different documentaries. Then there's a forest or city walk exercise where they take some of the difficult things to the walk with them. Then they need to reflect on artistic practices and pop culture, complete an assignment on Flipgrid, and also there are suggestions for practices to build discipline, stamina, and capacity for the long haul that are related to food, sound, and movement. So here's the Flipgrid, and there's a video of a student also that I was going to show, talking about their experience in the course. So it's very important to hear from a young person going through this to see them challenging our assumptions about education, about how much they can take, and the questions of shame, guilt, immobilization, and how we work through that in a very different way. So that's it. I think most of the things that I talked about are in the book, Hospice in Modernity, which is a book that talks about the experiments of the collective. The course is available under Creative Commons license on the first link, and the book is available on the second link. Some chapters are available there. So thank you for listening to me today.
Next, I would like to introduce Ben Rawlence from the Black Mountains College. Who's also doing something rather similar in some ways to Michael's initiative. So Ben is a British writer who's written 3 books, most recently The Tree Line, The Last Forest, and The Future of Life on Earth. He's now founding director of Black Mountains College in Wales, which is an institution devoted to creative and adaptive thinking in the face of the climate and ecological emergency. So welcome, thank you so much, Ben. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about your initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Good morning, everyone. And thanks both to Keri and Michael. I think the order of these speakers has been perfectly curated, since I think both Michael and I are instantiating good examples of what Keri has in fact called for. So we start from, I think all start from the same place, it seems to me, which is that the trying to take an unvarnished view of the present crisis and its multifarious dimensions, and grappling with what that means. And I think there are two starting points here for us. The first is that a certain amount of warming is in the pipeline, it's unavoidable. And that means there is uncertainty, and the purpose of any public education at this moment in time, then it has to grapple with that question. And the second one is that, you know, we don't necessarily know how that uncertainty is going to unfold. And what we do know is that this poly-crisis, in a way, it's a civilizational crisis, I think, as both Keri and Michael have agreed, not just in terms of emissions, but also in terms of ways of thinking, in terms of our social and political organization, our economic models, and the stories that we tell ourselves. And that was really where I came at this as a writer about 10 years ago, coming to terms with the fact that the scientific models I could see were projecting unavoidable warming, and yet the public discourse was still one that was expressed in the conditional tense. So I'm pleased to see that in the last 10 years that gap has narrowed, but there is still a lot of conditionality out there. There's still a lot of James Bond narratives, as Keri spoke about. So the question that in a way, I think my story is even more sort of left field, in the sense I don't have a background in academia. I was a writer and political staffer, but came to education as what seemed to me to be the most appropriate way of responding to the climate emergency, to an era of disruption, given that systems change on the scale and in the timeframes that was necessary was unlikely. And therefore, this personally for me was a journey about devoting myself to a more relevant struggle that would prepare, that would leave me feeling as though I'd made a meaningful contribution to the lives of my children and future generations. And what that's led to over the last 5 years is a collaborative project called Black Mountains College, which essentially aims to be a learning community that can explore some of these questions, and I think very eloquently set out by Keri, and I've obviously come across some of her writings before. But the pyramid of the litany, the structure, the worldview, and the myth is absolutely the starting point for BMC. So we have crafted an approach here, which is essentially about public education. So Article 12 of the Paris Treaty, an often neglected article, says that parties shall cooperate in taking measures as appropriate to enhance climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information, recognizing the importance of these steps with respect to enhancing actions under this agreement. Now, obviously, our government is not complying with that article. I think very few governments are. And we've taken it upon ourselves to try and play a role in doing that. So what does public education mean in an era of planetary crisis, and with all of the hazards that Michael has set out? And our answer is that we must pursue public education in all its forms. And that means that there's no singular focus on higher education or further education or short courses, or indeed, online publicly accessible lectures. It's all of those things. So Black Mountains College here in Wales is a mission-oriented institution, and it is devoted to exploring and inviting anyone who wants to come to join us to explore that future and what that future might look like. So we run short courses, we run one-day events, 2-hour events. We have a further education program which is up and running at the moment, which is a MVQ level 2, which is free in Wales, funded by the Welsh Government. And we've just had validated a Bachelor of Arts in Sustainable Futures, Arts, Ecology and Systems Change. And that undergraduate program, we are hoping to launch for recruitment later this year, with entry in September 2023. And what that commitment, that mission-oriented commitment does, which to my mind, every institution, whether in higher education or any field of endeavor at the moment, should have some bearing on this crisis. It's a bit like being in World War II. I think it's a common analogy. When there is a general mobilization, everything should be oriented towards that particular effort. So what that does is it then reframes all of our operations, our structures, our employment practices, our curricula, actually in quite a helpful way, because it's all interrelated. There is movement between short courses, further education and higher education. People may join for a degree, but actually end up specializing in coppicing or regenerative horticulture. So on those 3 levels, we have an exploratory pedagogy, which is all about whole body learning, very similar to Michael, and indeed inspired by Black Mountain College, which is why part of the coincidence of the name here in Wales is we added an S, because that's where we are here. But we very much draw inspiration from Black Mountain, the focus on the body, the integration of artistic practice with scientific endeavor, and that transdisciplinary approach. We also have here in all of our courses, both further and higher ed, a focus on real world context and real world problems. So trying to really enact the concept of a civic university. So for our undergraduate program, for example, we don't have sports teams that are dedicated to the university. People join the town football club, the town rugby club, the town tennis club, and so on. We also then have a range of a very different approach to assessment, to partnerships, to employment, to opportunities within the community. So we have community members on various steering groups and task forces. We have a 120-acre farm here, which we're in the first year of a 7-year land use plan, which has been co-created with the community, with the students, and various stakeholders. So the last point I'd like to make is about is really about that sort of wider engagement and the social purpose of an institution of learning, because I think it's a commonly held notion, and I think one that's uncontroversial, but that is rarely practiced, that universities properly integrated into their communities, the community should be the site of, should be the beneficiary of learning, should be a site of research, should be absolutely integrated into the activities of the academy, and that academy itself should be a catalyst for the flourishing of the region, and not just in terms of jobs and hard numbers in terms of induced employment and things like that. And this is important when it comes to recapturing that sense of what a civic institution does and should look like is essential when we actually come back to the top level of Kerry's pyramid, which is the litany of science. Because the reality of the environmental picture here coming at us very fast is that we probably don't have 100 years. We probably got 25 years and even less before many of the structures which allow big institutions to function start to unravel. And that's why the emphasis here on the learning community with a farm that grows its own food, that is playing a role in building a circular economy in the region, in the Brecon Beacons National Park here in Wales, is critical. And I think that really is important, that whatever we are building and however we are running things, we also need to be informed by the wonderful science that has been produced by the Academy as it currently stands, which shows that, you know, all of those adaptation timelines in AR6 IPCC are real, and we have to be adapting and building institutions with that in mind.
The first question, though, I'd like to put to both of you actually comes from Brannon Anderson. So Brannon, thank you for submitting this question. You talk about both the alternatives that you've heard about here as being really great, but just to read your question, however, most of us have to work within the confines of a typical university. So how do we engage these issues with the students in our classroom? She teaches environmental and sustainability science. So the key is the myths of capitalism they believe in and trying to move towards alternative visions. How would someone do this in a literature class or computer science? So perhaps Michael, I think, because you work in the humanities, perhaps if I turn to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Yeah, well, I'm actually my training's in English literature, so I can definitely respond to this. It's about representation and how identity is culturally determined by the governing myths of our existence. And I think in terms of literature, one has to see that the sense that humans are above and apart from the natural world, rather than by being participants within a web, is very much a historical phenomenon that kicks in the Renaissance, and that this is in fact fairly new within the history of the human race. And if it was instigated around the beginning of the 17th century, it can be corrected. So I think the use of literature is extraordinarily valuable in terms of giving us a set of comparative experiences that show there are alternatives to the current destructive pathways that we're engaged upon. Can't really answer about computer science other than suggesting that the innovations in this area come from martial activity, and that great question of who benefits, who is instigating this, what are the purposes, and how can this apparatus be made into a tool of liberation within the context of biopolitical crisis. I don't think that any discipline need preclude these kinds of inquiries.
Thank you. But there is a question as to how to augment a very siloed curriculum offer, and how we do that in such a way that is beneficial to students. And I think that's something that David Wheeler will talk about when we come to his presentation. Ben, would you like to add anything to that or respond to that question at all?
Sure, yes, I would. I think I've just put a link in the chat to a recent essay by Rupert Reed called A Moderate Flank in the climate struggle. And I think it's very interesting because what it proposes is something that we've been doing here, running workshops, which is to help people center the climate emergency in their own life, and to look at ways in which they can take meaningful action, which help them individually, both psychologically cope and make meaning, but also we do that by being useful, by the inner work and the outer work. And I would say really that most of us probably know within our institutions, within our own jobs, what the limits are, what the opportunities are, what the levers might be to bring some of these questions to bear. And occasionally one can seek help with that, or one can seek alliances within a workplace or a family or a community. But the next job then is actually summoning the courage, mapping the power, the territory, understanding what risks you're prepared to take, what fights to have, because essentially, I come back to World War II, when you have a wider framework, everything that, or let's say a wider context, a wider planetary context, everything that we are doing at this time is happening in that wider planetary context. Outside it is 421 parts per million, and it's going up. And everything that we do has to be seen in that context. So when you widen the frame, all of a sudden then, when you have that conversation about the reading lists, about the revalidation of the program, about the expectations of the students, about the editing of the updating of the student handbook, that context has to be brought to bear on all of those micro decisions. And that really is I would say the sort of an option, a way of thinking, a way of both, being meaningful, answering that question, living truly, let's say, at this time. And only you probably individually know what those things are, but there is a whole ton of work to be done, and lots of opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a good point, isn't it? Enabling students to see issues from that widest perspective and to see the big picture. And I'm reminded of an essay that Julia Steenberger wrote recently, and also some work that Andriotti been doing, in which they talk about the need for us as educators to act as if we actually believe the science, to not simply stand there and describe what's happening in ever more grotesque and scary detail, but to actually behave as if we really believe it, and to have some authenticity and some integrity in how we teach and communicate about these issues. So thank you. I'd now like to move to another question which has come in. So the talks from everyone, and especially Keri's pyramid, shows that there are so many different aspects to the crises we face. There are plenty of people that feel that the focus on their own discipline is not enough, but also not sure how to bridge to the other aspects. So what are your views on how much to do this and how we might actually go about building those bridges to other aspects? So for example, if you're teaching geography or computer science or English literature, how do you go about building those bridges to talking about the wider picture and other aspects of what's going on? Michael, would you like to start with that one?
Yes, it's a very complex question. I suppose really I've always thought in an interdisciplinary way, and I find myself at a university now, which is Cambridge, which is quite old-fashioned and antagonistic to that. But I think one of the problems we've got in the mainstream of academia is that so much of our energy is self-referential towards careers, towards the institution, towards thinking about how the university sits within the wider social body. And it has lost that antagonistic or that dialectical relationship to society. As I suggested in my talk, we now think of ourselves expressly as a trade school in all but name. And so it's actually very hard to do this without radically reinventing the institution, which is what on a small scale we're trying to do.
It is a difficult one. How do we go about it? We don't have all the answers, but we have some ideas, and David and I can talk a little bit about that later on. Ben, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's hard, and the current institutions are not set up for that. They are very much trammeled. Nonetheless, I think there are opportunities, and I think it's really about confidence. If you're confident as a teacher and you think that this context is important, then I think there are multiple ways it can be brought in, through team teaching, through inviting colleagues to come to other lectures, through visiting speakers, through a pedagogical mix. So we've done quite a lot of what we call counterpoint pedagogy, where we have a formal lecture which is cognitive, and then we have an embodied experience with meditation or drawing or paying close attention to something, or even just referencing the texture of the air outside and thinking about what carbon dioxide feels like. Those are things that that kind of pedagogical approach can perfectly sit within a narrow disciplinary lesson plan. And the last thing to say is, again, there is a space within existing universities for real world problems and applied projects. And those will always be multifaceted and will always bring in social, environmental and political issues. So I would say there's a lot of space. Yes, the institutions are difficult, but this is also about us being creative and innovative teachers.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, I think, before we move into David's presentation? So this is from Fidelis Allen. It's a very interesting question. What is the possible role of decoloniality in making universities really civic and community oriented in dealing with the issues of climate change? Michael, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, well, I think it's impossible to think outside of this, especially with regard to climate justice. The Progressive International suggests that the end of the world has already happened, but its effects are being felt and unevenly distributed around the world. I think it's now the air we breathe, and it should be. What does concern me about the university's embrace of this is perhaps a lack of sincerity. I don't see much interest in the possibilities of alternative modes of social organization, alternative cosmologies that non-Western societies can enrich our lives with. It seems a little tokenistic at the moment. Again, I think we need a wholesale reevaluation of our entire canon. Universities that all have a meta-narrative of power, legitimization and canonization, and it really needs some kind of deep structural reappraisal of how we can decenter our curricula away from an overbearing Western dominance. That is the key to understanding any possibility of reconfiguring the relationship of the human to the more than human world.
Thank you, Michael. Ben, would you like to comment too?
I would, yes, I'd like to agree that it's absolutely central, and to understanding, we have a module called How Do We Understand the Past? And that, if you put various lenses on the past and problematize the canon, and indeed, you know, lots of universities have been doing this for the last few decades, it's critical in terms of understanding the current moment. All I would say here is that I did see Vanessa Andriotti's name in some adverts for this event, and I would simply urge everyone to look up her Decolonizing the Curriculum handbook, which she's developed with colleagues and the working group on decoloniality in Canada, because that has very practical guidelines for how to do it in terms of showing up differently, how we involve different people in conversations and so on. And I think that it should be standard practice across every curriculum, and it gets to the heart of the epistemological questions as well that Kerry was raising at the beginning. So I would say yes. I mean, it was certainly a big part of that handbook played a big role in the design of our curriculum, and I would urge everyone else to look at that.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Also a reminder to people, we are very pleased to say that we have Vanessa Andriotti speaking in our 5 p.m. session today. So I'm sure she will speak to that issue. And just a final comment from me, again, picking up on something Kerry mentioned, which is a tendency for academia to identify a particular problem and then just to give a kind of tokenistic response to it. And so we saw that with equality and diversity some years ago. We've seen it with sustainability, and in the response typically is to not actually rethink and reimagine the curriculum portfolio, but simply to develop a module on sustainability, for example, or a module perhaps on, decoloniality. And that is not really, I think, an adequate response to the kinds of issues that are being raised. I think what the panelists have said really is that we really need to reimagine what education is fundamentally for. What is higher education for? It's not simply there to be in the service of the economy, which is actually driving us over the cliff edge. I think many of us feel that the typical education in universities is so far away from offering depth. It's hard to know where to begin. So it comes down to interrogating our own teaching, and especially if it has a particular disciplinary focus, and as most curriculum does, it's sort of very much a siloed endeavour. We'd like to ask you if you have any advice for making those first practical steps.
That's a good question. It will depend on the context. But I think in my case, I think there was a moment where I felt extremely constrained by the institution. And if I looked for support within my own department, for example, I couldn't find much. But then I also find that there are cracks in the university where interdisciplinary conversations and engagements and collaborations can happen. So we managed to pass this course, for example, the Facing Human Wrongs course at the university, out of a collaborative effort to find interdisciplinary funding for course development. And we managed to bypass some of the hurdles that would have been placed on a single faculty. So interdisciplinary work is definitely part of the answer. Transdisciplinary work too, like the collaboration with the communities also helped a lot. In the collaboration with students as well. If the students, we had a group of students around us who were indeed having an analysis where they were saying the university is coddling us. We're not being honest about what is actually happening. They are treating us like children because they feel that we can't take it, but we are already exposed to the truth. And we would like the university to give us tools to deal with everything that we're having to carry, all the weight of these multiple layers of complexity. But most of the courses are focused on solutions and giving us hope. So we did have student voice on our side. It's not all students, that's the other thing. But that's one of the, I think one of the things that we have to use as leverage to be able to do these things. One of the interesting things that happened was that when we approached the university to say we wanted to do a course that would open up cans of worms and not put the lid back on and then take the worms to the land, they said, well, look, it's in the middle of a pandemic. We already have increasing levels of anxiety, depression, and even self-harm on campus. Are you sure you want to do that? And we had to stop and think about it and come up with a sober answer to that question. And we said, yes, for some people, opening up the cans of worms can take you to a spiraling mode that maybe we can't, it's not the best thing. But for other people, and especially the students who are working with us, it is the fact that we are not being able to contain the worms that is creating the anxiety, depression, and self-harm. So different people relate to the complexity of and the uncertainty of these issues in different ways, and we need different courses. That's why ours is a targeted course. We ask students to do a sample unit, and then there's a questionnaire, is this course for me, where we really grill students on, is it the time to open these cans of worms for you? And if not, maybe that's just not the time to do this course right now, right? So it's been a huge learning process, but working together, I think, is the only answer.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think, you know, as a former academic myself, you know, one of the things that I've come across in talking about change within institutions is the structural complexity and the structural problems, which can seem overwhelming. And that's why we've separated out the institutional change strand, which will be the focus for future discussions. But then that does still leave us, and you know, as an academic community, thinking, well, how do we build agency, and how do we have those difficult conversations with each other around, you know, what we can actually do with curriculum and with our teaching. And it's those particular questions that motivated the development of our hub, or hive, if you wish to call it that. It's a repository of online educational resources and a whole series of other incredible resources that look at the bigger picture, and look at things holistically, and look at the decoloniality. Michael, I'd like to turn to you now. So an observation here. So the new school sounds brilliant, and most of us are stuck in typical universities for now, and thinking about how to navigate our teaching from within this particular context. So presumably you ended up founding the school because you'd come as far as you could in pushing the limits of how you could teach in Cambridge. So are there any steps you took before you reached that point that would be useful for us here, bearing in mind that the majority of us are in conventional universities?
I am also in a conventional university. I have a foot in both camps, but I decided to strip back some of my commitments and leap. I was bored with my own anger and impotence. I realized that I'd probably been part of an environment comprised of complaining and moaning for the best part of a quarter of a century. And I would also add that I am the world's worst moaner. There comes a time when you just have to leap. And I think this is it. I didn't want to go on like this. I think probably the main motivation here, and speaking autobiographically, is I left school with no qualifications. I come from a very non-academic background. And neither of my parents had a chance to stay on at school beyond the age of 14 because of wars in different countries. But I had a chance to reinvent my life by taking evening classes. Living in London in the 1980s, there was this extraordinary book called Floodlight. It was the size of a small telephone directory. And it was full of classes that would cost you about 10 quid a year. You could get an A-level for 10 or 15 pounds. Nowadays, it would cost you 2,000. And that gave people a chance, I think, to discover the life of the mind without courting fabulous levels of debt. Now, this, I think, is very important. The way to think more freely for students, the way to envisage a future, is to demonetize higher education, because otherwise you are trapped. And I see that so many of the students that I deal with are depressed, they're anxious. And I don't think this is a matter of individual psychological dysfunction. I think they have every right to be anxious and depressed and hopeless. And that perhaps the idea of instigating the kind of curriculum that Vanessa is talking about, hopefully the kind of institutional change that my friends and I are interested in, there can be some level, not of hope, but of expectation of a different future, a set of channels whereby that may be accomplished. So I think that that sense of how do we create a condition of desire and expectation and agency, rather than that passivity of hope, which is a word that is, I think, carelessly bandied around and I don't think does any of us any good. I think we should be demanding change. And I think that the students have got a lot to teach us here. And I think that the Faculty for a Future really comes out of XR, it comes out the Fridays for a Future. I remember Alison talking to you about 3 or 4 years ago about the student strikes. I mean, there was a real momentum before COVID, and there was a real chance of something happening because it was a bottom-up grassroots surge, a howl of outrage and a demand for a future that was sadly destroyed by the pandemic. So the historical examples are there, and we just need to seize them, I think. And one of the things the new school wants to do is, it is an experiment, but it's also a recovery, that we look to prior models of alternative education. And I'm delighted to say we're not the only ones. You know, there are others springing up around the country now, which I think gives us cause for hope.
Thank you, Michael. I love the way you put it, that you were bored with your own anger. I was bored with my anger too, and quit academia, which is, you know, it's one way of dealing with it. But we're all here on this call because we share that frustration, we share that deep desire and that deep passion to see change. And it's that brought us all together in Faculty for a Future, and that's led us to reach out to all of you to try to connect, because what we've found is that connecting and having these difficult conversations is empowering in itself. And we're hoping today that in listening to these amazing presentations from Vanessa and Michael, and I'm about to introduce David, that there will be some renewed enthusiasm, some momentum, but a kind of active hope, an active hope, and also that we will give you some options as to how you can participate, in our teaching hub by, obviously going to the website and having a look and looking at, signing on and joining us. Okay, I'm going to introduce David now. Thank you so much for your presentations. Just before I introduce David, though, just to say that we are planning, David and I will be hosting an extended and more participatory Q&A session around about 6 o'clock. So David is a senior advisor to Faculty for a Future, formerly a university president, dean of management, and endowed chair of business and sustainability. and he has 4 decades of senior executive involvement in sustainable business practice, research and teaching. He's worked as an advisor to many governments and NGOs, as well as the World Bank, the United Nations, the Canadian International Development Agency, the Canadian International Development Research Centre, and the UK Department for International Development. So David, I'll now hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging what a great job Vanessa and Michael have done in framing the remainder of this event. Because what both have essentially called for is experimentation whilst also working within existing institutions. And I think that's core to our challenge. How do we have myriad experiments happening that show what's possible, that draw on the thinking that Vanessa's new program has developed, that draw on the inspiration, hopefulness of Michael's new venture. You know, if we could only harness those and, you know, many thousands more such experiments, and if we could share the results of those experiments within a global community of practice, then I think change could really begin to take hold. And at that point, you know, either the existing neoliberal corporatized institutions die under their own weight of contradiction. You know, I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. Or something else emerges alongside and through them, which is driven by student demand ultimately, as Michael was referencing. You know, if we can get that student demand going, and we have a global community of practice ready to receive that demand and turn that around into scaling some of these experiments and changing the way things happen, then I think we're all potentially going to make a significant contribution. So a big thank you to Vanessa and Michael for framing things so well. So I'm just going to talk for 10, 12 minutes just to get us to the point of, I hope, having a vibrant conversation about how we can build that global community of practice where all the great things that are happening can be learned from and replicated. So I'm going to show a few slides here. Hopefully everyone can see that. And, you know, I'm just going to say a word about my own personal background and worldview. Alison gave me a very generous introduction. Another thread that she didn't mention that's not on my formal CV is I've caused a lot of trouble along the way. I've challenged a lot of institutions and bear some of the scars for that. But I have no regrets, of course. And I do think that all of us that consider ourselves to be activist academics are occasionally going to take some heat for that. And one hopes that you can carry your colleagues and your students and civil society and governments with you, but that's not always the case. But I do think we do need the ability to stir things up. And I guess we've got the right people on our panel today to role model that, and the right people in our participants as well. So, you know, I've had some successes and some failures in greening up curricula in different parts of the world, mostly in Canada and the UK. But of course, what drives me is the urgency of the different crises we are facing, and therefore the really urgent priority to provide today's students and tomorrow's students with the kind of skills that Vanessa was talking about and that Michael's developing through his venture, those resilient skills that are going to actually carry people through. And then how do we do that at scale, given the nature of the challenges that we're all facing? So there is some good news. I will caveat that good news in a moment. But some of the good news is that demand for and access to higher education globally is increasing. And over the last 20 years, it's more than doubled from around 100 million students in higher education to 200 million. Now, we can pose the question, are they being taught the right stuff, or are they going to be just turned out into cogs in the capitalist wheel? That we can debate. But the fact that the students are going there, and they're going there because they think they're going to do better in their lives for going there, is actually a strength. It's something we can build on. And also what's happening globally, according to UNESCO, is that we are beginning to see a greater gender balance. In fact, women are now more present in our institutes of higher learning than men. So again, I think that's a good thing. There's still plenty of countries in the world where that doesn't happen. Afghanistan would be an obvious example. But globally, women are participating in ever greater numbers and now exceed the number of men in higher education. And of course, as economic development occurs here in the global south, I'm based in Costa Rica, and in the global north, that again comes with caveats. Much of that growth is unsustainable. The aspirations of the middle classes around consumption and so on are part of the problem, and inequalities continue. But again, we can look for seeds of hope in the way academia is opening up and the room that is emerging for change and experimentation. But again, according to UNESCO, even with 230, 250 million students in higher education in the next few years, there's still 100 million missing out who should be accessing higher education. And of course, part of the raison d'etre for Faculty of the Future is that no one is really thinking through deeply enough what the 100 million that aren't being served or the 250 million that are being served will need to navigate their lives and their careers over the next 20, 30, 40 years. We are not doing that adequately as an academy currently. Now, there are some great experiments going on. I mentioned experiments in the context of Vanessa and Michael's work. There are also some larger scale experiments going on that, again, I think point the way to where change may reside. There is a relatively new institution called University of the People based in the States that is now providing free higher education to tens and hundreds of thousands of students who wouldn't otherwise be able to access it. Its constraint is that it's largely volunteer driven and foundation funded, so that makes it less scalable, but nevertheless something has been demonstrated here. And it reminds me of the time when I was a university president in Canada, where I got together with the student union and the faculty union. We said what Canada really needs is free tuition, and again this was mentioned by Michael, and I think I'm probably telling no tales out of school here to tell you that I was the only president in Canada making that case, although of course there's a huge social case to be made for it, and the price tag is actually relatively little. So governments do have a role here, but currently governments are not engaged. They're going in the opposite direction when it comes to funding the system. And whilst the system is ever more dependent on student debt and decreasing government funding, it's difficult to imagine automatic scaling of the kind of ideas that we're talking about happening in a top-down basis. And for University of the People, difficult to imagine scaling because of their dependence on volunteerism, which obviously is constrained. There's also something called OERU. Again, lots of great partners, universities around the world, but again, dependent to a large extent on the goodwill of individual professors who want to share their stuff in the global commons for free. Again, not necessarily scalable, because ultimately students need assignments set, they need grading, they need coaching. It's not just about what you can access online. And then when it comes to sustainability questions, there's another beautiful experiment going on called the Sdg Academy, driven primarily by UN interests, obviously because of the SDGs. And again, they've begun to form communities of practice, which is something we can learn from and build upon. Lots of free education resources, but again, nothing yet to show that this is catching fire in the mainstream. So that's really where we want this conversation to go in a few moments' time. So how do we organize the normal processes of higher education decision making? The kind of process that Vanessa went through to convince her colleagues at UBC that her experiment was worthy and worthwhile against the norms of disciplinary and silo thinking. So how do we make that more normal to be able to work with the system, work with existing processes, whilst also simultaneously taking into account the demands of the climate and other crises? And how do we then parlay that into what students need and will, we hope, be demanding in ever more loud voices in decades to come? So our approach, simply stated, is this. We believe ultimately everything has to be driven by student need, and student need has to be encouraged and supported and nurtured, because that then is taken seriously by institutions that expect to collect their tuition. So that is, I think, crucial to unlocking the institutional resources that are required. We also think there needs to be what I've described as a vanguard of enlightened academic program leads and academics generally, the kind of people who are part of this webinar, who are prepared to look at what it takes to make experiments happen in normal institutions, so that then we can catch fire through the normal systems of reward for endeavour that universities tend to use. So, we've started by carefully selecting a group of MOOCs, 30 MOOCs by world-class institutions and world-class scholars around the world. They're not all TOOCs, Vanessa, but maybe some should be. But these are MOOCs that we think could be implanted into programs across all disciplines. That we think starts the potential for conversations in regular institutions that are non-threatening and which are positive. And then, ultimately this all has to be scaled again by student demand. So, we've got these 30 world-class MOOCs that we are now recommending officially and formally for uptake around the world by program leads and by program champions and individual academics. We also have ideas around the co-development and again, particularly involving colleagues in the Global South and institutions in the Global South, a set of transdisciplinary super MOOCs that might draw everything together, a bit like the way Michael and Vanessa are thinking. We also have a growing resource base of what we might call supplementary teaching resources. There's toolkits for institutional change. And last but not least, we've issued a call for people to join disciplinary panels, because in most universities it's the disciplinary conversation that holds sway, at least for now. So we want people to join international disciplinary panels, south, north, east, west, which will allow discussions around what we can learn from the examples of Vanessa and Michael and many others, what we can continue experimenting with, seed into existing universities, and perhaps with the support of our students, then scale them. So I will close now and simply pose this final question before opening things up for discussion, which Alison will drive. Can we imagine creating a genuinely global community of practice? And could that start with getting people into panels where they discuss the institutional challenges, the silo challenges, in a disciplinary way before breaking out from that, whether it's adopting MOOCs or experiments such as we've been talking about today. So Alison, with that, I'll stop and pass things back to you.
So it will take a minute or two for us to ensure that those of you who want to be to appear live on here, then actually do so. So whilst we're waiting for that to happen, I just want to say a little bit more about some of the work that our wonderful team have been doing behind the scenes, particularly a shout out to Clara Saglietti, who's been most closely involved in the Teaching Hub work. The Teaching Hub aims to pull together open access teaching resources. So in a sense, we've tried to make a start on a job, but we can't do it without you. So what we're asking for is for you to come on side with us, on board with us, and to help us by actually referring us to resources that you might yourselves have discovered. And also you might like to participate in vetting or scrutinizing some of the things that we found. But really what we want to do is to build some excitement and build some momentum around the urgent need to transform curricula. And one way to do that is for us to share information and a bit like a spreading activation network, and to share information and to be enthusiastic about it, to use it and encourage our colleagues to use it too. I'm a big fan of the scientist Katharine Hayhoe, and one of the points that she comes back to again and again when people say, what can I do, is talk about it. We can each talk about it. So we can talk about the kinds of resources that we've come across. We can start to figure out how to use them and use Faculty for a Future and use our network to discuss how to overcome those barriers and how we're going to do this. So it's not just about the disciplinary panels. We have put a huge amount of work into collating and curating some resources that we hope will be of use to you. And the disciplinary panels we've put together in a way which may seem counterintuitive, because we're very much talking about transdisciplinarity and why that matters. But for many of you, your point of entry is through your disciplinary background. So resources are indexed in terms of their sort of notional disciplinary affiliation, but many resources will be matched to more than one discipline. And we're also indexing resources in terms of the kinds of issues that they speak to, so that you can enhance and augment your curriculum in really creative ways. So we're really quite excited about this. So what we're trying to do is offer you a service. We've made a start on it, and we're now welcoming as many of you as possible to come on board and work with us and to take this further, so that we make this a really exciting international global initiative. I can see Adam Aaron there. Adam, you've already put a question to us. Would you like to put your question live? You'll need to unmute if that's...
Yeah, sure. Thanks for this.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, hi, everyone. So yeah, my question's about the sort of ethics of radicalizing students in our classes and what people think about that. Briefly put, I think the first speaker put it really well, that when I teach about this, probably many of us do, we're stressed, right? We're really worried about our world, and we're coming before the students there because we're worried about our world. And I certainly stress the students out enormously just by talking about RCP and the fiction of these various pathways of the IPCC and just how grave the whole thing is. And so they get in quite a state. And if I would leave them like that, it would be terrible and they wouldn't want to take the class. So I try to embed ultimately a more hopeful kind of vision that really connects with the imperative for collective action and pushing the political system. But that requires kind of taking a somewhat radical view on just, or truthful view on just how fucked things are, right? And how incapable the political elites are of actually doing anything. And so it's sort of opening up this vision of what collective action looks like, what grassroots pressure looks like, what advocacy looks like, and how people can participate in that. And I think I'm fine doing that. I'm not getting in any trouble doing it. But I could imagine there'd be some tepidness in various universities about this ultimately, because we confront our own institution itself, which is a massive emitter of carbon dioxide, the University of California, right? I embed that in the class. I critique my own institution with the students. And I think various assistant professors wouldn't want to do that, for example. So anyway, my question is really, what do people think about this? Our responsibilities to radicalize students and the issues that may be around that.
Thanks, Adam. Great question. And yeah, Adam is an academic activist at UCSD doing research, and he's actually changed his career track from neuropsychology to research on the psychology of climate change, which is really quite amazing. Michael, can I turn to you, because Cambridge is a very traditional, conventional institution. I mean, perhaps you've got some thoughts on Adam's point.
Yeah, well, Cambridge for decades, if not centuries, has been involved with preparing and processing young men for positions of administrative authority. And I think it's very seductive and very impotent, actually, to think of power as a purely top-down singular line, whereas we all have power. Power is multi-directional. It's constantly in this occupying a series of dynamic shifts, constantly changing. And to encourage people to actually think autonomously, give them the agency, give them the critical ability and the creative confidence to create their own organized systems, their own patterns of behavior, their own projects. We don't have to wait for the permission of the people in authority. We can self-organize, we can seize the initiative ourselves. And I think what education could do is to give prior examples of people who have done that. Change always comes from the bottom up. It is always a grassroots initiative. It is not the benevolent donation of hegemony. And I think that we need to somehow, as educators, give students that optimism and that confidence and that ability to seize the discourse.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone like to comment on that response or add anything? John, I see your hand raised there. Would you like to?
Yeah, so my question was actually about this, and yeah, thank you to all the presenters. I think the question of the capabilities of higher education educators to actually change their own pedagogy, their own institutions from within is a really complicated one, and it's one which isn't really well understood at all. I mean, I agree that this is the challenge, and the question is, how do you do it within the neoliberal university? It's very, very difficult, and it's striking that both Michael and our other speaker, sorry, I'm just looking for your name, I've missed it.
Ben.
And Ben, sorry, have stepped outside of what we might describe as traditional academic structures in order to create more radical opportunities for environmental education. The question I have is really, how do we transform the institutions, the kind of mainstream academic institutions that we work within? Because so I work at King's College London. King's is regarded as doing quite well with sustainability. It's nationally recognized, won an award recently. It mainly does work around its operations, right? So it has introduced recycling, it's doing divestment stuff. All of this is important, but its core business of education remains very kind of tokenistic, right? If there is very much in terms of the pedagogy itself. And so this is sort of widespread kind of critique of higher education institutions themselves as failing to live up to their educational responsibilities when it comes to environmental change. So how do we change it from within? I think it's that question of structure and agency. I agree with Michael that we all do have power, but how do we use that power? And I think we need to be conducting research and analysis of what it would take for educators within mainstream higher education to actually change their practice, because I don't think we know very much about that. So yeah, I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that.
Thanks, John. It's I mean, as a former academic, I that what you say really resonates with me. It's actually very hard, and of course, your line manager will reinforce the view that it's actually very hard to effect change, and yet that's absolutely what we need to do. I'd like to go to David, who I know has some thoughts on these barriers to change, and also on the kinds of solutions. And obviously, as Faculty for a Future, we are working on ways in which we can work with you as academics to enable you to help you optimize your own sense of personal agency so that you can in fact drive change. So David, would you like to comment here? And then we'll move to Fidelis, who I can see has his hand up there.
Yeah, thanks, Alison, and yeah, thanks for that great question, John. I saw it in the chat, and I was very much hoping we'd get to discuss this live. Yeah, I think it ultimately, as I mentioned in my contribution, comes down to student demand. You know, if we can mobilize grassroots student demand and students go to their academic program leads, if they go to their institutions requiring the greening of curricula, then I can tell you institutions will respond and program leads will respond. But I do think it all comes down to that in the end, you know, broad system-wide change. So picking up on you know, the other question from Adam about, you know, the ethics of all this, you know, I think, you know, supporting students to demand more is very ethical. You know, it's basically getting students to demand what they need from their institutions and their programs. And satisfying that need is us doing right by our students. So I think that's the number one point. In terms of the tactics of this, and I think that's where Alison was inviting me to go, you know, the fact that we've been able to identify 30 MOOCs now, which have fantastic content, and those MOOCs could be incorporated into any program, right? Very easily. So, you know, if you're in the global south, and you know, Fidelis, let's ask you to address this. If you're in the global south and you're in a cash-strapped institution, because all institutions are cash-strapped, they're especially lacking in resources in the global south. And you say to your program lead, or you say to your dean, you know, guess what? You know, let's adopt this MOOC from the University of Michigan or the University of Cape Town or wherever the MOOC may come from. Let's put this in our program. It costs nothing. All we have to do is to provide, you know, the assignments and the conversion of that MOOC content into credit. And guess what? You know, we've made a contribution to greening our curriculum. If we can get that kind of thinking, using open educational resources to spur change without every individual program manager on the planet having to think through, okay, how do I employ someone to develop a class that addresses these issues? Then I think there's a way to fast track all of this. But as I say, ultimately it comes down to student demand. But very keen to know from Fidelis what the world looks like from Port Harcourt today.
Thanks, David. I will come back on that, but yes, I'd like to go to Fidelis. I believe you're in Nigeria, so welcome, and please put your question to us.
Yeah, mine is like a question and a comment. I have taught in the university here in Nigeria for about 26 years, and I've worked with students and worked with civil society. Where you have students who lack the passion, who are not disposed to looking at environmental problems, looking at climate problems from the point of view of passion and ideology. It's so difficult now. The oil and gas industry in Nigeria is the mainstay of the economy. And the political class sees any threat to the oil and gas industry as a threat to political aspirations and positions, even as a threat to national security. Now, in the Niger Delta, where I have been and taught for so many years,
Your audio is breaking up. Sorry. Sorry, Fidelis, your audio is broken up.
Research. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We've got you again now, but I don't think we got the question in its entirety. But I think what you were asking us is what can we do in a situation where the students don't have.
Yeah, let me go straight away to ask the question.
Yeah, thank you.
How do we deal with new liberal thinking around the climate crisis in an atmosphere of new liberal support of civil society, new liberal support for policy? How do we deal with these issues with students?
Okay. I'm looking to Michael and David. Would either of you like to respond to this question? Michael, thank you.
I think it's the key question, Fidelis, and I think of a quote attributed to Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, who said it is more terrifying for people to contemplate the end of capitalism than it is the end of nature. I don't think, as a critical mass, we have the ability at the moment to think outside the constraints of capital. That said, as teachers in a classroom, we have enormous freedom and independence. But we are mortised inside a system which is concerned only with replenishing and reproducing itself. And the way it does that, I think, is through inculcating young people and returning learners into disastrous levels of debt. And that is not only a financial, but a psychological burden, which means they have to think instrumentally about survival. So therefore, education has to be about training skills, preparing them to pay off this debt, to participate in a society which is excluding them ever more radically in terms of the possibilities of securing housing and jobs.
Peter Horton.
I'm not in academia. I don't work in academia, but I am obviously very much concerned with the same problems that you are in terms of education. I'm an artist, a performer, and a writer, and I was in academia until very recently. It strikes me listening to the talks, and I agree that, you know, everything that's been said is very positive. There are a kind of couple of strands that I'd like your reaction to. One of them is, for example, I think it was said, I think in fact you said it, Alison, that there is this deep passion for change, which people are sharing. And I really question, my question is, but change for what? What seems to be lacking is a unified, positive, all-inclusive vision that we can go, this is where we want to go. We can talk about all the problems which we have talked about, but where is it that you want to go? And I'd just like to give an example from my own kind of background about where I think we might find this kind of vision. You'll all be familiar probably with Yuval Noah Harari, the Sapiens man, the professor of history at Jerusalem University. And he has a very lovely 14-minute TED talk, if you've never seen it. And it's called, Why Do Humans Rule the World? Have any of you seen that? Nobody's seen that? Okay. In that, he says, why are we as a species in a position to rule the world, in inverted commas? And he very clearly puts that down to the fact that we have the ability to organize ourselves in large numbers flexibly, and to have with an imagination to invent fictional realities. And when you bring this concept of fictional realities to the way we behave as a species, you can see, and he himself, Harari himself, gives you this list, that things like nation states and universities and education systems are actually fictional realities that we have invented as a species, and they're purely human-centered. And that asks the question to me: are there realities out there which we haven't invented? Okay, so the weather and things spring to mind. And in the world, is where we might find the unified vision. That's my kind of question. Where is the?
Sorry. No, that's fascinating. So it really, I mean, it's a question that resonates, because I've elsewhere I've heard people talk about the paucity vision and the need for these new social imaginaries. Vanessa, if you don't mind, I'd like to put you on the spot there and invite your thoughts and comments on that. Peter, could you mute yourself again, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
This is a much longer conversation than just the time that we have to have here, but there are different sensibilities and ideas about how humans have conquered the world and are ruling the world, but how this figurative thing also is or not necessary to tap what's viable but unimaginable. So we tend to think that our imagination is enormous and that it is responsible for creating images that we then bring people with us towards. But there is another way of thinking about imagination, which is something that trespasses you and works in the process of building relationships that is mainly or mostly unimaginable to Western societies, but that Indigenous peoples have worked with. And the same happens with other things like knowledge. If we think about it as a problem of lack of knowledge, then the MOOCs are an answer about just coalescing everything. But if we think about it as a problem of relationality, the MOOCs are not going to help. The more knowledge and more information is going to remain undigested. Same thing with hope. Here in Canada, if we look at the interface between settler and Indigenous people, when settlers talk about hope, Indigenous people hear hope in the continuity of colonialism. And of course, it's not the same kind of hope that we're talking about. Therefore, a lot of people have been saying, I don't want to hear about your hope. Your hope is an escape from dealing with the shit that we have to compost together in the present. The same thing with agency too, Alison. So in Western society, generally agency is perceived in association with sorting a problem or creating change. But building relations based on trust, respect, consent, reciprocity, and accountability is a lot of work. That's agency too, but that's the kind of agency that gets invisibilized in this process. So I think bringing first, before we try to create this image, like bringing people together to repair and build relations that are not prefiguring where we want to go and then dragging people along and are not an escape from the difficult things that we have to do in the present would be the first thing I would do.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa. Michael, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I entirely am in sympathy with the spirit of Peter's question, but I'm a little worried about the very premise of a unified vision and a program because of its shades of totalitarianism. People with a unified program, I think, are very worrying, and there are quite a few of them in the world at the moment. I prefer to proceed, I think, through the spirit of via negativa, through a critique. And instead of a vision, I think that idea of dealing with the next emergency is possibly the way that we can avoid falling into authoritarian behavioral patterns ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Just changing tack slightly. Now, we had the privilege of hearing Keri Facer speak this morning, and in her presentation, she made a great point that we teach from a place of our stress about the crisis, and because of that, we in turn make our students stressed. So in Keri's absence, it might be interesting just to hear and to explore what Vanessa and Michael think about the role that stress plays in our teaching, about the ethics of radicalization in teaching. Vanessa, would you like to take that one?
I think in our research collective, we have lots of metaphors, and one of them is about the shit, right? So, and it came out of people wanting to be connected with each other, but they want to be connected with the sun, the moon, the stars, and the dolphins, but not with the amount of violence that is necessary for us to be here together. So there is a stress in trying to visualize what academia and Western knowledge production has invisibilized and developed capacity to sit with that. So instead of removing people from the stress, there is a responsibility in in terms of me as an educator dealing with my own personal collective and with learning to compost shit, basically, but also that this transfers into the pedagogical move. So the students are going to have to live with the stress that we created, that the previous generations created. And the education is not really creating the capacity or the containers for us to be able to move this process together, this composting process together. So in composting, there is stress. I know that I'm not talking through the same metaphor that that Kerry might have been talking about, but if we think about the composting of the shit and the staying with the trouble, the weathering of storms, the facing of shadows, then we might be opening up possibilities that from the usual perspective, they are unintelligible and unimaginable, but they are viable for us to build these different relationships together.
Thank you, Vanessa. I love these organic metaphors that you're using. They're very powerful. I'm now going to put Jordan on the spot. So Jordan hasn't participated in this event so far, but he is the behind the scenes inspiration to Faculty for a Future. He's our chief executive. And I would like to just give Jordan a couple of minutes to say a little bit about the Teaching Hub and what we're trying to achieve here. So Jordan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Alison, and thank you, all of you, not only our speakers, but everyone who's come along today. It's so great to see you come along and see your faces as well. It really makes a difference. I just want to actually maybe for a second reflect on my own learning experience. You know, I'm not that long away from having been a student at a university, and then I became an academic briefly and gave teaching. So I've seen things from both sides of the track, and I studied psychology, which actually, you know, it's not that hard to see how psychology would be relevant to the environmental and social crises that we find ourselves in. But that was 2011, and I didn't get a sliver of environmental related education in my teaching. So I guess there's two elements here that I would like to explore in the context of what we're trying to offer, you know, because what I'm seeing a lot here is this energy to be sharing experiments, to be pulling together all of the different things that people are doing in this world of trying to weave environmental and social crises into university education as an era rather than an issue that's limited to certain disciplines. But I guess I would like to ask a question in the context of what we're trying to develop. How important is it, and what kind of support do you think people need to even just make that first step to just actually providing the information? Because obviously information is not enough, but actually in a lot of cases the information is not even being given. And so what do you think is important for academics to be considering about their own roles, whether they, you know, are an anesthesiologist or a 17th century art historian? And then I guess beyond that, responding to some of the things that have been said here, particularly around information not being enough, right? The techniques that we use, the pedagogical techniques are super, super important here. I was treated as a vessel, an empty vessel to be, you know, imparted information onto, rather than an active participant in my own future. And I'm sure that if I had been given the information about environmental crises that we face, I wouldn't have been given the emotional coping skills, and I wouldn't have been helped to see myself as playing an active role in actually creating the future. You know, going back to what Peter said, you know, I'm not sure that anybody knows what the vision for the future is. I think that it's up to us to, you know, maybe the biggest thing about education is to give students the capacity to feel like they can create one, because a lot of them don't. You know, so many of my friends have just completely checked out. So I guess I just want to ask, beyond the information, you know, I see quite a lot of potential for reform and revolution in pedagogical techniques, you know, even with the current material that people are teaching. So do you see, you know, how can academics who are thinking about making that practical step, you know, how can they think about their own teaching and transition how they're actually seeing their students? You know, is that in some ways actually easier than changing the content? It's a question for everyone, really.
Oh, thanks.
Long
Thanks,
one.
Jordan. That's a big question. A very long. It's a very good question. Well, Vanessa, you've just developed this TOOC, and you're actively teaching your students. Could I turn to you first for a response to that?
So again, like coming from the decolonial analysis, this impulse to create the future and to get the students to create the future, we understand that as also problematic, as it can become this thing about conquering and finding that just reproduce the same ways of being that have created the problem. So what we are trying to invite the students to do is actually to decenter, disarm, declutter, and disinvest in what's harmful, which is a very different pedagogical move than making them feel empowered, because it's the empowerment of a certain subjectivity that created the situation that we are now, and we need to figure out a way of existing differently in co-creating this. It's not our, even in the metaphors that we use the metaphor of hospicing, a dystopic world with integrity, actually, and then offering prenatal care for the new, because if we think we are creating it, we reproduce a lot of the problems that have actually created the old, right? So we offer prenatal care and understand that as this baby is going to be born, we are trying not to suffocate it with our own projections and idealizations, so that we can work together in the sense of trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, which is what I think our Indigenous collaborators are saying is what is missing in the Western approaches to this issue. It's focusing on it's the quality of relations that will create the future, not an image that we have of what we want to conquer or to achieve. I think that's the main message.
Great, that's a fascinating way to put it, Vanessa. Thank you. Michael, would you like to chip in here? And I'll come to you, David.
Yeah, very quickly. I'm completely enchanted by what Vanessa is saying there. And it makes me grieve for the fact that in my current university, there are literally no circumstances where I could envisage the application of such an emotionally intelligent and intellectually sophisticated approach. Because I think in the mainstream universities in Britain, learning is so utterly individualized. You know, we really are completely Thatcherized, I think, as not only in terms of the way we offer a curriculum, but in terms of the way we work together as academics. It's very hard to build solidarity. And we do not impart, I think, to students that even the possibility of the collaborative, certainly within the Russell School universities, which are, you know, avaricious and extraordinarily ambitious. So all I would say is that this is one thing I would hope to instigate within the new school as something that's absolutely central to its episteme. But within the mainstream university, I'm really at a loss as to how we could implement this, sadly.
Thanks. Now, Penny, you said you would like to jump in and comment here, and so thank you. Please feel free to comment.
Yeah, thank you. And hello, Michael, again. It seems like an age. But yes, I put some things in the chat, but I'm lucky to work at a university that is really forward thinking. I work at Belfast University. Half the week, I'm an artist. And then the rest of the week, I run I'm director of research on the funding applications for a charity that's devoted to young people's creativity. So to Jordan's point, and obviously, Vanessa, that was really interesting to hear. My PhD was about self-directed inquiry, and I say it's here. I'm just writing my book, my monograph, but I think what I've been lucky to witness in our university is working alongside students and teachers, academics, professionals, working with the cultural and creative sector on literally co-designing live projects in response to real world events. So for instance, you know, around climate change. So Forest for Imagination is one of our projects as an example, and it's all about kind of imaginative solutions to, well, we're in a triple crisis with a pandemic, you know, the war, the ecological emergency. But I heard what you said, Michael, about not having passive hope. And I think what we do is more aligned to Joanna Macy's kind of hopeful action, that once students and alongside colleagues take responsibility for coming up with some co-inquiries to explore these spaces together, that's what's important for me in terms of teaching, because then everybody is part, as Vanessa said, everybody's part of that kind of ecosystem. And it leans on the, you know, Three Colleges model as well. I think model, that wouldn't be the right word, but the philosophy behind, you know, linking mind, society and environment. I think that's really important. So I'll send you an article I've just written called Spaces of Possibility. But yeah, I'm very hopeful, Jordan.
Thanks, Penny. That's a really, really important observation and comment. So yes, I'm still reflecting on Vanessa's comment about it's the quality of the relations that matter, as opposed to the vision per se. David, would you like to comment at all, particularly in relation to one of the objectives we have for this session, which is around, you know, encouraging you as best we can to come on board with us and to help us. You know, this is it's a joint effort. You know, we're trying to collectively co-create and co-curate resources that will enable you to reduce your own stress, but reduce the stress of your students too.
Yeah, and I did want to address in passing a comment that Vanessa made around MOOCs only being knowledge. Whilst, you know, that may on the surface of it be true, our intention for how that knowledge is mobilized, many of these MOOCs have a lot of critical thinking, a lot of anti-colonialism built in. Our approach is to simultaneously empower those academics who may be sampling some of that free material and using it and including it in their programs, to support those academics to do that in exactly the way that Vanessa would, I'm sure, also advocate for in terms of her own experience. And I'm always thinking about, okay, what does the academic in Chile, you know, who's working 2 jobs, has no institutional resources, what do they do to make a start? I mean, how do we support them? So partly it's, you know, encouraging access to the knowledge, but it's also supporting them in this global, potential global community of practice. On Jordan's question, which does get to the heart of things, you know, I do think that we have to give people a starting point. And for some, that may be a simple starting point. But knowing that there is a space where they can go for support and validation amongst their own peers, and also validation from the students who want to take their classes or their programs, it is absolutely crucial. So you know, I'm a real pragmatist when it comes to how you scale things up. We don't have the luxury to have, you know, lots of perfect experiments. What we must have is lots of messy experiments where we learn and we immediately recycle the learning and share the learning. And we have to include our colleagues in the Global South in that, because they need our support, they need resources, and they need to be validated in many cases. And so I think we really do have to drill down into what that looks like and engage as many people as possible in that conversation, because it's tough. It's tough in a British university or in a Canadian university. Tough enough making things happen. It's 10 times tougher in an under-resourced institution in the Global South.
Thanks, David. And I do want to just come back to the students again. Something that struck me in my career as an academic is that students or prospective students are placing their trust in us as academics and as educators, and they are trusting us in that the curriculum we offer is relevant and is not going to cause harm. And one of the things that concerns me greatly is that trust is potentially misplaced and creates a huge amount of stress amongst academics who know that the curriculum offer is potentially not what it should be. And there are numerous examples of academics who are, with the best of intentions, standing behind courses that are actually making the climate and ecological crisis considerably worse. And that's something that I feel, you know, we each of us as academics have a responsibility to look at that and to stop perpetuating harms. Just as a final couple of points then on one of the objectives for this session, which really is to try and build some enthusiasm and to point you towards the our website, so facultyforafuture.org, and particularly to the teaching pages and this amazing collection of resources that Clara has curated and put together. They're resources that are not just about the climate and ecological crisis, they're about the intersecting crises. So we invite you to go to those pages and then to sign up. If you don't quite feel ready to sign up, then contact us. And we would be delighted to start a conversation with you, to talk with you about how you would like to contribute your knowledge, expertise, and your time, your precious time, so that we can work together and build a really amazing global academic community. This is our Teaching Hub launch. We will have a Research Hub launch, which is taking place next week, and then another launch event around public engagement work that Josephine has been doing. But we will also, over the next year, have a series of events. So the idea is to engage all of you and your colleagues. So we do invite you to spread the word. Please, if you're using social media and Twitter, then please feel free to comment and to talk to people about what you've listened to here, the kinds of conversations and presentations you've heard from Michael and from Vanessa and David. And we very much look forward to seeing you in the future. And Jordan, I think, wants to have a final word. So Jordan, over to you for the last word.
No, I'd love to go to Vanessa. I saw she had a hand and I'd love to hear what she had to say about those things.
Vanessa, would you like to make any final closing comments?
Thank you, Jordan. I was just in relationship to the MOOCs. I think it's I do understand the practicalities of the precarity of institutions in the Global South that may need the resources, but at another layer, there's also a political economy of knowledge production where just bringing these knowledges to the Global South may exacerbate other inequalities and problems. So sitting with all the layers where as we're trying to solve one problem, we may be creating another is part, I think, of the container that we have to be able to articulate the paradoxes and to be able to walk in a good way.
Thank you, Vanessa. And it's great that there's so much energy in this room and so many points that people want to continue to make. So it just makes me feel sort of really happy to invite you to come back. Please come back and continue the conversation. It's been wonderful having you all online here. I hope you've enjoyed it. I found it really fascinating. It's fantastic that you've all contributed. And enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll hear from you again soon. Thank you so much for joining us.